And that complicates everything. So as they are growing closer, things get even more complicated because, oh no, he has enlisted her help to track down a serial killer in the kingdom. But the serial killer that they are looking for is Saoirse, and he does not know it. So she's trying to lead him astray. He has feelings for her. She has feelings for him. It's all very complicated. So yeah, that is Sing Me to Sleep in a nutshell. And then Drown Me with Dreams is the continuation of their story. I won't say much just to not give away spoilers for book one. But yeah, that is the duology.
But they're both on the cover, so.
Yes, they are both on the cover. So they're both, there. There are vibes between them. They brought both books.
Yeah, I'm a romantic asexual, so I can't really take the hot thing. I'm just like, he's a murderer! Whatever. So sirens, to my knowledge, they originate from Greek mythology. Why them? Why an aquatic setting? Why not vampires? Why not fairies, trolls? Like, why sirens?
Well, so it's interesting because like every mythology and pretty much like any culture in the world has some version of like a siren myth, and they all have kind of different stories about mermaid-like creatures or siren-like creatures who are known for singing to like lure particularly sailors to their death. But the reason why I picked sirens is because of a Zoom call I had with author friends. Because before I wrote fantasy, I wrote mystery and thrillers, and so I was querying for a literary agent for a YA thriller, and I was on a Zoom call with some author friends. It was around Halloween time, so like spooky season, and we were talking about monsters, and one of them mentioned sirens, and I was really fascinated by the idea of like sirens as monsters, and just kind of the idea of like, okay, well if your whole nature, right, is to like lure men to your death, like how much of a monster are you if you can't control it? And then the question is, can you control it? And so I was really fascinated by the idea of sirens. The thing is, I didn't want to write it because I didn't like writing fantasy.
What?
I really didn't.
Woman, there's the door.
Well, so my two like least favorite things to write were world building and descriptions.
Okay, descriptions. My editor has already called me out for that multiple times.
Right? It's like the worst.
Where are we? Are we on Earth? Is she a human or an alien?
Like, I don't know. Figure it out. Use your imagination. But because of that, I didn't really want to write fantasy right off the bat. But the idea just kind of stuck with me, and it was just a little nagging voice in the back of my head. So I was like, okay, I guess I gotta write this stupid thing. And then I did.
I feel like, so this is a duology, so
Yeah.
it's book 2 and then it's done. What, and I'm certainly not asking for myself, who is writing the sequel to Citadel, have you come across what are the difficulties you have found between writing a sequel versus writing the first book? Like, is it easier?
No.
Is it harder?
Yes.
What is your experience writing the sophomore novel?
Oh gosh. So writing the first book was a very quick process. I feel like the story just kind of came very naturally. Writing the next book, because it's not just writing a story, it's like wrapping up all of the character threads. It's like making sure there's a satisfying ending for everything. And of course, even though like I just said, I don't really love world building, I decided to base the second book in a totally different world, which requires all new world building, which was a foolish choice on my part. I will never do that again. But that just required, doing kind of the same things again, but in a very different way. And that part of it was difficult. But the fun parts of it are like, you have established lore for your characters. You get to play around with your characters, just kind of leaning into their personalities. So, for example, the main character, Saoirse, is, a manipulative liar. That is her personality. And in book 2, I get to lean into her being a manipulative liar, which was really fun to do.
There you go, yeah. You don't like world building? What the heck?
I'm sorry.
That's not, it's so funny when I almost laughed when you said the first book was so quick for me. Citadel, my first novel, was 14 years in the making.
Oh, wow.
I literally started writing it when I was 12. The very first 300-page pile of garbage that I wrote. You can trace a direct line from that to what landed on shelves just last year. And now Blackstone Publishing is like, okay, we want the next draft for that by January. And I'm just like, January of 2040?
Okay, but that's amazing though. Sorry, not to reverse the question process, but like how much of that time did you spend on world building?
That's true, yeah, so like, I usually start with the world building because okay, so you know the difference between pantser and plotter, right?
Yeah.
Okay, for you guys, generally speaking, writers fall on this spectrum between pantser or gardener and plotter or architect. And the whole idea is basically how much do you plan ahead with your book. Pantsers are insane and they fly by the seat of their pants. They don't plan anything, no outline, no world building in advance. They just go, and it's nuts, and I don't understand them. Plotters, on the other hand, are the ones who they do very detailed outlines. They create the whole world ahead of time, so that way they just have to drop their characters in. They have character sheets describing in detail what each character looks like, what their deal is, their arcs, and all that stuff. And then, of course, there's everything in between. I'm much closer to plotter than I am pantser. And so, for me, the world building of the most recent version of Citadel, that took a couple of months. It usually takes me between like 2 or 3 months to really comfortably get into the world that I have created. And this is like far sci-fi. Excuse me, I just had Chipotle. Far sci-fi, high fantasy, and I have a bachelor's in history. So I just love diving into, okay, how did the characters get here? What created this world? What's the story behind that building? Just all that stuff. And then when I'm actually writing the story, it tends to go a lot easier for me because I've already created the sandbox, so to speak. Now I can just drop the characters in and let them run around. But yeah, so for that, it's funny you mentioned world building because in the original drafts of Citadel, it wasn't a sci-fi, it was a post-apocalypse of our world.
Okay.
And throughout various iterations, I realized that the post-apocalypse thing wasn't gonna happen. And then,
was that because of publishing or because of personal choice?
Because of personal choice.
Okay.
Just for some reason, like the characters were doing their thing. Olivia, the main character from Citadel, was very much present. She was there. So was her friend Riley. Her father was actually the main antagonist in the earliest drafts. Then I switched it later. But it was the setting that I kept running up against. And then Star Trek, the alternate original series, did its thing and got me into Star Trek. And that was made me think, oh, what if it happened in space? And I had this completely different idea for a story. What if flying telepathic telekinetic wolves in space? And then I thought, wait, how do we get to space? They don't have thumbs. And eventually I merged that idea and said, okay, here's how we're gonna start. And eventually I do want to get to the point where we go up to space, but we're still stuck on the ground. And I want to be in space already, but I gotta work through books 2 and possibly 3 before we're up there. And I don't know why, there's just a weird mental block whenever I try to work on Sanctuary, book 2. I can push through it, but it's causing more difficulties than any other book that I've written before, and it's my first sequel. So, I don't know, maybe I'm just overthinking it.
No, I very much had the same process with Drown Me with Roots. I don't know what it is about sequels, but I think it makes it a lot harder because I've written other books, but this one was by far the most difficult.
Maybe it's the pressure thing? Like you guys, maybe you're the problem?
I am.
Thank you for admitting that.
Yeah, I did panic email my editor a few times, like, yeah, I don't know what's happening with this book. There might not be a book. And she was like, it's okay, how about we have a call? We'll brainstorm together. But I was like, yeah, no, this might not exist. Who knows?
I feel like 80% of editors and literary agents' paycheck and hours spent is just calming frazzled writers. Babysitting us as we're having existential dread.
Absolutely.
Okay, can we just push this energy towards the laptop, towards the computer. Just, if you're feeling big feelings, that's okay. We need to make money off of it. I love my literary agent. Don't tell her I said that. Okay, so now I want to, because you're all here, and as lovely as it is to hear both of us talk, I do want to open up the floor a little bit to any questions, comments, concerns that you guys have, preferably for Gabi, as she is the reason that we are here, but I will take some myself if you have some for me too. So any questions? Oh, we got a hand.
Okay, so you said you didn't really like writing fantasy. Is this the last book you're gonna write for fantasy, or are you gonna do more?
No.
We got her!
I have another 2-book series coming out with Bloomsbury. The first one comes out in 2026, and then the next one will come out in 2027. So they got me locked in. Yeah, so
We got it.
No, it's true. I kind of like it now. I can't help it. It's kind of fun. I have to admit it. It's a good time. I still don't really know that I love descriptions, but world building is pretty fun. I will admit that.
It is super cool, especially if you're a history geek like me, where you can base it off of some obscure historical time period that no one ever really hears about, and you get credit for being creative. But also just like when I was a kid and I just loved world building, I'd be like, I am the god. I make everything. It's great. The weather, who lives, who dies. I needed some help when I was a kid. Any other questions? Or yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I have a friend who is actively writing her first ever book. She is currently having writer's block. She's been having it for a month. She doesn't know how to get past it. Do either of you guys, since you guys are both authors, have any suggestions that I can give her on getting past it?
That is a very classic question. How to get past writer's block. Gabi, what are your tips and tricks?
Yeah. Okay. So first, do you know if your friend like plotted things out beforehand?
It's actually based off of a D&D campaign she was in
Ooh,
years ago.
that's
so
fun.
she's doing like the
Pre-plotted.
background on it.
Okay, so a good trick I would say is to skip over the parts that like she literally doesn't want to write, because you can just write the fun scenes and you can go back and do the rest later, because the important part is finishing the book. Because if you're writing your first book, you have to get through it. You have to let it be awful. That's like a really hard part for a lot of newbie authors. It's like acknowledging that your first book will be trash. No one writes a good first book.
In the words of Ernest Hemingway, the first draft of any novel is shit.
Yeah, it has to be. So like if the way to get through that is just to like write the scenes that are fun, the scenes that she's excited for, then she should just do that, and she can go back and write garbage, for the other scenes later. But like know that that's very normal. Like everyone, I promise you, everyone is writing garbage on their first book. Everyone.
I can say her book is so good so far. She has that whole D&D group reading it. We are all like,
And that's part of the problem though, because if she's like writing like really like elevated like prose like the first time, well then you're like attached to like, okay, that means like the whole rest of the book has to be like this. It doesn't though.
Mm-hmm.
It's very normal for like the quality to like slip, past like the beginning, because the beginning usually is that part that you have the most fleshed out in your mind. So like that's the part that's gonna like flow the easiest, it's gonna look the best on the page in your first draft. But just keep in mind that the rest of the book will get to that level eventually. It's just through editing. So you have to let that first draft, at least parts of it, be really bad.
I will definitely give her that information when I get home. Thank you
For
guys.
yes, absolutely. For me personally, it depends. Normally, writer's block for me doesn't exist. It's more project block. Like I have to do this book, but I really want to write this other book instead. Like I just got a fresh idea for a brand new thing. Ooh, shiny. So for me, what I do is if it's really bad, I'll usually set current project aside for a hot minute and go focus on the other one for just a little bit. Just get the idea out on paper. It's usually scraps of world building, little bits of character arc, the concept, maybe a little bit of the plot. I have a whole folder on my laptop dedicated to just story ideas in the rawest, messiest form. And I write it and I save it, and then I go back to the other project. Or I'll work a little bit on my Blackwing novella series if Sanctuary is giving me trouble, or my Cafe Latte book if it's giving me trouble. But if you can't do that because you have a deadline or you don't have other projects to work on, another thing I have found is to kind of trick my brain into getting really excited and inspired about it. And that's usually for me watching YouTube videos about writing advice, specifically about the tropes or the concepts that are in the story that's given me trouble. So for me, it's usually Overly Sarcastic Productions has a really great playlist called Trope Talks, where she analyzes specific tropes. And you know, if I have a 5-man band in my story, or a jailbreak scene or something like that, she's done videos about that. So I'll watch those, and that tends to get me thinking and really excited to write that next part. Writing Advice with Jenna Moresi has some really good videos on that. Hello Future Me has some really great world building videos. Yes! Oh, I love him so much. I need to buy his books.
Yes.
They're so. Granted, I already know all this stuff anyway. But the thing with writing is you're always learning. You're never gonna be a true master of your craft.
If anyone wants to get into Hello Future Me, this is such an aside, but you should start with his like 2-hour video on the Avatar: The Last Airbender video.
Are you serious?
I
I just watch his on writing and on world building
Because
stuff.
that'll like
I
get
don't
you
do
into
the-
like his style of just like talking, and I feel like it's just like a funny video to like ease you into it. But I mean, if you're into like long form content,
I'm not. I like the short stuff. I usually have like a half-hour cap, so it's perfect for me. He's also done a really great interview with Brandon Sanderson,
Ooh, okay.
where they sat down and they were both like, "What is the top 5 worst writing advice that you've ever gotten?" And it was really interesting to hear not just this guy that I've been following on YouTube, but also Brandon flippin' Sanderson bitch about bad writing advice. It was great. So yeah, watching other authors, if you're having trouble with world building, watch some Brandon Sanderson videos. That tends to be my go-to, is to just kind of kickstart my brain a little bit by absorbing other people's work and advice. Or if my work was inspired by a specific book, like if I was to do Greek Gods AU, I'd probably reread all of Rick Riordan, just because it's going to get me thinking of, okay, how would I do this? How would I take this myth and do that? And that once I get my head to that point, then it's just like, okay, yeah, you can't stop me. I will die in front of this laptop, or you have to bury me with it. But yeah, lots of advice, and it's really just, it's the thing with writing advice is it's so individual. I
Yeah.
don't know, yeah, okay, because like what works for me might not work for you, and what works for us might not work for your friends. So it's really, unfortunately, it's just a kind of mix and match, sample it, yeesh. Hope it works, and if it doesn't work, move on to something else. What the hell is with this thing? Yikes. I actually did want to ask you, what is your least favorite bit of writing advice?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Or least helpful, maybe?
I feel like a really unhelpful piece of writing advice is show don't tell, because people just say it without any like specifics. I think it's most helpful when applied like to a specific thing, like, hey, so this section of your writing, you were doing a lot of
No
showing.
descriptions.
Yeah. But I feel like people just kind of say it as like blanket advice, and I don't think that's something that's like easy to hear and then just know how to apply it to a whole book. Because of course you do have to show and tell. So I feel like it's more useful as advice if you're looking at someone's writing and you're like, hey, this section you're doing all telling, like how do you show here? But I feel like it kind of just comes up as just kind of blanket advice. And I don't feel like that's particularly useful if you're just getting into writing. And I've seen a lot of people who were like, oh my gosh, like, I have to cut out all telling. I'm like, no, that you can't write a book that way. That will be like 1,000 pages. You cannot do that. So yeah, I think in general though, the more specific you can get with writing advice, the more useful it is. And I think show versus tell is, in my opinion, like the most egregious example of just blanketed advice that people apply way too much without thinking about specifics.
It really does come down to how do you deliver exposition.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is another Hello Future Me video that he talks about. For me, it's probably you must write every single day. And no, you don't. You want to write most days, or at least some days. I am a content creator and author full time now, thanks to my fans who give me money so I can do this. But before that, obviously, I was a broke college student, and then I was a PCA, personal care assistant and job coach for adults with disabilities, and then I was a sales manager. And then I was unemployed, and I was able to write pretty much every single day thanks to COVID-19. And then unemployment ran out, and I worked at an Italian deli for 2.5 years. And you can bet your ass that after a 10-hour shift, dealing with Karens on my feet all day, I am not gonna be writing. I'm not gonna extend any more brain power beyond heating up my leftover dinner from last night to eat and sitting in front of the television to rot until it's time to bed.
Yeah.
That's, you see, yeah, so you write when you have time, is what I would say. Like, obviously, a lot of times the people who give that advice, they're like, they are trying to say, you need to make it a discipline, you need to make it a habit. Because if you just write when the inspiration strikes you, you're never gonna write. You're gonna get maybe 1 or 2 days, and then that's it. So you have to have a little bit of self-discipline to make yourself write, even if it's just like 300 words, which may sound a lot to you guys. It's not. It's like half a page. But you know, doing it every single day, sometimes that's just not feasible. Sometimes you just can't do it. You have other stuff going on. You have family or friends to take care of. You have another job because writing pays pennies. Or you have, you know, other content that you're creating, and so you can't take time for your novel. All your creative energies is going to your social media or whatever. So that's, I always get so annoyed when people are just like, you're not a real author if you don't write every single day. Like, you, how many books have you published?
Yeah, any advice that's like, you're not a real author unless you do this, it's just never correct. Never. Like, no.
Or Stephen King tells me to do that. Are you Stephen King? Again, his book On Writing, which I have read, and I do recommend you guys read, if nothing else, because it's very entertaining. That's just how Stephen King is able to write his books and do his thing. His advice does not work for everyone. He is a pantser. I can't do that.
And most people who are writing books that have as many twists as his do can't be pantsers. Some people can, obviously, but most people can't. So you don't have to model your life after Stephen King.
Oh my gosh, so my mother is also an author. She does paranormal romance. I don't know if you got Mary Janice Davidson, the Undead series. A secretary is fired and killed in the same day, and she rises as Queen of the Vampires. Her generation of authors made the vampire sexy, so
Okay.
we're sorry that if that didn't happen, Stephanie Meyer would not have had a career. But yeah, she's a pantser. Getting an outline or synopsis from her is like pulling teeth. It drives her editors and agents insane, and I was like horrified when I found out. It's like, you know, writing out oh my god, my mother came from the enemy. It's like, what am I?
Yeah, I absolutely cannot pants at all. If I like don't have at least a general outline of where things are going, I'll just stop writing.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a while to realize that, because I would like start books and I get like halfway through and then I would just stop.
The midway slump
Yeah.
because the story's not going anywhere anymore.
Yeah, and I need direction. So I will spend, I don't know, like a few weeks outlining until I have like a full idea of where everything's going. It'll definitely change. Usually my outlines don't include endings. Endings come. I will write multiple drafts of like the beginning through like, I don't know, I can't do fractions, like 5/8, and then
Just over half?
and then the final like 3/8 will be like, who knows? And I'll write multiple drafts, and then I will write an ending. That is usually how it goes.
That's bizarre. Like, you're wrong. I'm sorry. There's no wrong way to write a book, but you're wrong. For me, I have this book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is a really great resource for anyone who is just starting to write. And she locates the biggest beats of a story. A beat is when something happens in a story. And so that's like, you know, the opening, you know, where we start, the catalyst, when, you know, things change, the midpoint, you know, you don't want that saggy middle, something's got to happen, the lowest point, and then the climax. And that tends to be what I figure out first, and then I fill in the gaps, and that's my outline. And sometimes I'll change my outline. Like there's been more than one occasion where I'll be halfway through writing the book and then I'll realize, no, I want the character to do this instead of that. Or, oh, there's no way this character that I had planned for the ending is gonna make it out of this alive. And then I'll just have to rewrite the entire back half of the outline. And that's fine. Still need that parachute though. So, yeah. How are we doing on time, madame?
Good. We could do.
We're good?
If people have more questions, we could do
Oh,
that.
yes, we got a hand.
What is a book that you both have recently read that you loved and would recommend?
Ooh. Oh, this is just fresh on my mind because I just got a copy of it in the mail. But Voyage of the Damned by Frances White, I do love. Because so I like thrillers and I like mystery, and it's like a combination of both. It's like a murder mystery on like a magic boat, and it's also very gay. It's a great time. It's a good book.
There you go, there you go. Okay, you did kind of lose me, and then you said gay. Okay,
That's usually like the selling point.
I've been going through a little bit of reader's block recently. Partially it's because a lot of what I have still been doing a lot of reading, but I've been doing a lot of research reading. So it's a lot of stuff on like, fairy folklore, because I want to do a video on like the history of fairy mythology and how it's evolved over the last 2,000 years. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of research that goes into that. I'm currently reading, I actually have it with me. I did bring my crocheting because I wasn't sure how the setup would be. Assistant to the Villain. I'm almost about a third of the way through. No spoilers, and I did already get the sequel. It's sitting on the shelf because, like, I don't know. Am I the only one who purchases the entire series if it's there on the shelf? Kika, yes, because if you love it, then you immediately want to start the next book.
Especially if I'm thrifting them. I'm like, oh, I see.
Exactly.
I'm
And if you don't like the first book and you're never gonna read the next of it, then just give it away. Someone else is gonna love it. So there's that. If you really like nonfiction stuff, the best nonfiction book I've ever read, and top 5 books that I've ever read, is Wild Swans by Young Sean. And it's basically a family autobiography where she has traced, her grandmother, who is the concubine to a warlord at the turn of the century in China, her mother, who was like a communist spy who was like smuggling detonators and stuff into her home city, and then herself, who was born and raised in Mao Zedong's China. It's just beautifully written. You do not have to know anything about Chinese history to understand it. She does a really great job of explaining, here's what was going on in China at the time, why it was happening, and how it did or did not affect my family. And it's just a beautifully personal story too. And it's frankly how I wish all biographies, historical autobiographies, would be like. It's just absolutely amazing. I cannot recommend it enough. So probably not a fantasy sci-fi book that you were recommending.
It could have been any genre. I
Yeah,
read all
no.
things.
Wild Swans by Young Sean. That is an absolute must-read if you want to know anything about China, East Asia, the last century. Very well done. You, and then we'll do you.
Yeah, so I read the first book. I haven't read the second one yet, but I really, really liked the theme of how Saoirse didn't hold herself responsible for the murders that she did because she thought it was out of her control, and she is clearly kind of lying to herself about that and really wrestling with it and keeping it pretty vague for spoilers. The ending was still very ambiguous with that theme, which I was super impressed by and also surprised at how dark it was for a YA book. And I guess that was kind of a twofold question. Did you get any pushback for the darkness in YA and leaving that ambiguous? And also, what drew you to that theme?
I didn't get pushback for the darkness of it. Fortunately, my publisher leaned very much into it. But in terms of the ambiguity, yes, I like ambiguous endings. But I know that's not super popular. So my publisher was definitely kind of wanting a bit more. But I was like, no, we can wrap that up in book 2, and I'll leave it up to people to decide whether or not it is, if the ending to book 2 is ambiguous or not. But I kind of like the idea because, I mean, first of all, she's 17, right? What 17-year-old has like her whole mindset figured out? What 17-year-old really knows whether or not like I have choice versus like I have free will? They don't. And so I think she is very much still working through that. And I think part of the fun of writing it was letting her both lean into her instincts and question whether or not that was like the right thing to do. And I think in book 2, she starts to question more how much of what I think my nature is because of what I've been told and what sort of history I've been told about myself, and how much of that are other people writing my own history, rewriting my history, because that was an important theme to me, the idea of rewritten, stolen history. So I think in book 2, she questions that a lot more, which gives her more agency. The idea of like, my history that I have heard might not necessarily be my own. What does that say about me? What does that say about my agency? And to me that was really important to write. And so in terms of like the inspiration, I very much think that if you're like, you know, a Black American living in this country, there's so much history that is lost or rewritten all over the place. And I think it's important that you recognize there are some things you might never have answers to, but also recognize that you get to be your own person, like in the face of all of that. And so it was important to me that Saoirse as a character, maybe she doesn't have all the answers, but she still gets to be her own person, and that was an important theme of her character to explore.
That's awesome.
Honestly, as an adult, none of us have the answers.
Yeah.
And bouncing off of the YA thing, what publishers and booksellers decide is and is not young adult is weird and arbitrary, and nobody can agree. My book, Citadel, the main character Olivia is 19, and I wrote it explicitly as a new adult, so aiming for kind of college age people. And it's violent. There's no explicit sex in it, but it's violent and it has mature themes in it and all that stuff. And so many people were, and even my publisher was like, "This is a great young adult book," and I'm just like, "Is it though?"
I was at the Texas Library Association, and I was sitting with a group of librarians, and it was like a speed dating type of thing. And this was really funny to me because they would, since they were usually like high school, middle school librarians, they were like asking questions like, "Oh, is there like sex on the page?" And I was like, "No, but it is like really violent." They were like, "Parents don't care about that. They only care." And I was like, "Okay, cool." Like my main character is a murderer. She murders like, I think like 11 people on page in the first book, and they were like, "I promise the parents will not care." Amazing. So.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the other things. It's like character age also has something to deal with it. Whereas, but also at the same time, if it did, Game of Thrones would be considered a children's book because you got a lot of kids POV in there, and there are guidelines, but whether it's adult, young adult, children's, authors have some say in it, but ultimately we kind of don't, and that can suck. And then there's people like Sarah J. Maas who like leans in, even though she's really writing adult stuff. She's like, "Oh no, it's young adult." Like,
I think it's worth noting that's why my books are allowed to be like YA, but really dark, because my publisher is Bloomsbury, who publishes Sarah J. Maas. So you know they like that space that is like both YA and like adult. So yeah.
Your question.
Yeah, so you've talked a lot about world building today.
Have I?
So my question is kind of like, as you were approaching the sequel, do you kind of like, when you're plotting your novel, are you thinking more of like focus on the plot first and kind of build the world around it, or you kind of would prefer to like build the sandbox first and kind of put the characters in there?
It's kind of both actually. So okay, if we're thinking about like a book and just like a vague general like 3-act structure, I like to think about generally like, okay, this is gonna happen in Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. I don't know if it's gonna end, but like generally like speaking, like these things will happen. And then so once I know what those things are going to be, then I go and I think about like the world in which those things would happen. I think too, for me, characters are like a big part of the world building, especially for Sing Me to Sleep. I kind of based the world around how I wanted Saoirse to feel. So I knew I wanted her to feel alone. I knew that I wanted her to feel a little lost. So then the questions are, you know, why does she feel that way?
What type of world would create this type of person?
Right, exactly. So I like the idea of like the world being like centered around her. She is the center of her own universe. And that was very much something that was kind of fun to do. But then once I've developed the world around very vague plot points, then I go back through and make them like more specific. So it's like kind of both. You know, they are always interacting with each other, I think.
Yeah, I've had that happen with me too, even though I tend to start with world building and then characters, which is ironic because my stories tend to be very character driven. But at the same time, it's like for Olivia, I needed her to be a loner, an outsider. She's not the last of her kind, but she's very much ostracized from her society.
Right.
It's like, okay, so I need her, because she's a woman, it makes sense, you know, for the society to hate smart women. So patriarchal, dogmatic, ableist, she's autistic, and you know, just every possible box I could check to just make her and who she is at her core just not fit in with that puzzle at all.
Yeah.
But then also with leaving some wiggle room to create someone like Riley, who does fit in some of those boxes in some ways, but isn't so molded by his society that he's still friends with Olivia. So, I mean, we're created by our surroundings, but we also have some say in how we react to our surroundings. So,
Yeah.
Buddhist thought of the day.
No, that is ultimately the fun that I found in world building was in that idea, like the concept of like who you are is very much based in the world you grow up in, but at the same time, like you get to grow within that world on your own terms. And I think that like interplay between character and world building is, I will admit, it's a little fun, even though.
And you can also affect your world through murder sometimes.
Or by accidentally causing a war or 3. Spoilers for book 2.
Hashtag just girly things. Alright. Any other questions that we have before I pull one out of my ass? Yes?
Yeah.
So, I think my question is about power and agency, particularly as it relates to Saoirse's character arc. Like, there's a real sense in which the story she's been told about herself is that which makes you feel powerful has been demonized and unacceptable, right? And so she's trying to find herself and have agency or feel powerful in the world. Like, the very thing that makes her feel powerful is also the thing that makes her feel unacceptable and most alone. Can you tell me, like, how you build that, and then like I don't know, maybe like, because that seems like that character arc applies to like a lot of people in the world as it exists today. Like, so just tell me how you develop that and what you want us to learn from Saoirse, maybe.
Yeah, there's, oh gosh, this is testing my memory of the things that I wrote myself. But in book 2, there is a line where a character, I won't say who, says something to Saoirse to the effect of, they were afraid of you, and so they made you afraid of the things that like made them afraid of you. And I think that's very real. You know, if the best way to control someone or to keep them from rising up, recognizing your full power, is to tell you that the things that make you powerful, the things that make you special, are dangerous. Whether they're dangerous to yourself or a danger to society. And I mean, arguably, you know, Saoirse's urge to like murder people probably is like actually dangerous. But I think that like deeper than that, the question is like, but is it actually an urge to kill, or is it an urge to something else? And I think that's the part that I had a lot of fun with, because I think for most of book 1, she does think that this is an urge to kill. I don't want to give away spoilers for book 2, but it's rethinking what that actually means. Is it actually an urge to kill people, or is it an urge for control? If you've read book 1 or are familiar with it, whenever she is in the act of like killing someone, like a man, there's a moment where she has like absolute control over the situation. And those are like the moments that she actually loves. And like even in like the first chapter of book 1, she's like killing a man. She like turns away before he actually dies, because the part that she feels the most powerful during isn't the actual death part, it's the control. And so for me anyway, I think it was really fun to kind of explore the idea of what if the part that we're drawn to isn't, you know, the violence. It is like the actually having control of our situations. And so I wanted to lean into that a lot for book 1 and book 2, because I think book 2 just kind of builds upon that idea of like what is she actually drawn to? What is her actual instinct? And in terms of the real world, I think a lot of people feel very powerless, whether it's because of their situation, the world they live in, their instincts, and I think there's something powerful in saying like your instincts aren't wrong or dangerous. Society or whoever like wants you to feel powerless has just told you that they are.
I have a little bit of a toughie. So as an author who's also a queer woman, I have often seen my stories, my work labeled as not necessarily women's fiction, but definitely feminist fiction, which I agree with, and sometimes queer fiction, which, depending on the story, like yes, that works for Blackwing because every single character is queer, even though we don't really dive into the queer themes.
Mm-hmm.
Citadel has also been labeled queer fiction, even though all the LGBTQ characters are very much in the background. They're the side. I would not label that as a queer book. Have you ever had your books labeled as, queer or black fiction simply because you're a black author or the characters are people of color? And how do you respond to that?
Something interesting that I've definitely gotten is people assuming that my book is African mythology, and it's not. I'm not African. I'm Black American. You can call it African American. Both of those are accurate, but like I'm not African. My family's has lived here since slavery.
Where are you from?
Right, like where are you really from though? And it's not something that like is necessarily like I'm upset by. It's more just like I think people have a very specific view of what it means to be black. And so yeah, usually depending on who's asking the question, like it's YA. So if like a kid is to ask like, oh, is this like based in African mythology? I'm like, I definitely like took some like elements of like African mythology like in this book. If it's like an adult asking the question, then we might like get into like a more like a deeper conversation about like how I think the beauty of Black American culture in general is that it is something that was like built in the ashes of something that was stolen, but we built something new for ourselves. And so yeah, like I definitely wouldn't call this African mythology because I think that's inaccurate. And something that I wanted all of the characters in this world to be are unique, but also kind of versions of a blend of different kinds of mythology that come together, but also get to be their own characters, their own creatures.
Yeah, nothing Black American about that at all.
Yeah, and I think that's like the biggest thing. Yeah, so when people ask me like, oh, is this like African mythology, or oh, like I really love like African mythology, I'm like, I can definitely recommend you some books that are like based in like African mythology that are fantasy. I wouldn't call it that, but I mean, I hope that you still enjoy the book.
So, like, you mentioned that the inspiration for this was the Zoom call with your friends.
Yeah.
Someone mentioned sirens and mermaids. What were the other inspirations for your duology? Were there any, like, specific authors that you really looked up to and kind of hoped to emulate a little bit? Or is there, like, a scene from a certain book or TV or movie where you're just, like, we just kind of got, made the brain do the brain thing and sparks go? Or was it purely pulled from your own head?
I love Kristen Kishore. She is one of my favorite authors from childhood. She's the author of the Graceling series, if anyone is familiar. Yeah. Graceling, specifically Fire. It is like one of my favorite YA books of all time. But I feel like she was like the first time that I read a book that had like a strong, morally gray female characters. Obviously, like morally gray is like a very like popular trope right now. But she was the first one that I read. I'm not going to say she was the first. She wasn't, but she was the first that I read. And I really loved how she like really leaned into like the darkness of her characters. And that was like eye-opening. Like, oh my gosh, you can be dark and still be really interesting, or interesting because you're like a really like dark character. And that was a lot of fun.
It's not all black and white.
Yeah.
Speaking of morally ambiguous characters, something that I've noticed is that when you look at all of the morally gray characters in fiction, the vast majority of them tend to be men. It's usually male characters who have the privilege of being morally gray, of being anti-heroes, while femme characters tend to be usually at least primarily good or primarily evil.
Mhm.
Have you received any pushback for having a morally gray femme character?
Not really. I've definitely had people who were like, I don't know how anyone would ever forgive her, which I mean is your prerogative, but I think there's, I do think it's interesting because there's definitely, I can think of so many books where there's like a morally gray male love interest, and he does the most awful things, and then he just says
But
like,
he's hot.
right, or he says, but I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, and then it's just like,
But I
oh,
had a
it's
rough
forgiven.
childhood.
Oh my god, yes, the rough childhood. No. And it's like, but like one time I was sad when I was a kid, so that justifies everything. And I'm like, I don't know that does. I don't know. So I've definitely like noticed a difference in terms of who is like worthy of forgiveness, but I haven't had anyone like specifically say to me like, I don't know, like this character rubbed me the wrong way. But I do think it's interesting the way that it's like the bare minimum, like we are scraping the barrel here. Like, okay, sure, did I commit like a literal genocide? Sure, but I said sorry, so, and to me, not the same.
There's this amazing TikTok skit from a romance author who, I forget her, Elizabeth something, who does Daedrus Assassin.
Okay.
And she has this series, it was a short-lived series in TikTok where she is portraying the genres of romance, paranormal, contemporary, fantasy, and historical.
Mm-hmm.
And, the contemporary one was like, I think I'm going to dump the billionaire. And everyone's just like, why? Like, did he roofie you? Because the Fey Lord and I were able to work through that. Did he commit genocide in Ireland? Because the Colonel and I were able to work with that. Did he kill your parents? Because the vampire and I are working through that right now. And the answer is, he kicked my dog. Unforgivable. Everything else we can look past, but apparently the line is drawn at animal cruelty and cheating.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That TikTok sound. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Oh my gosh. I can excuse racism, but I draw the line at animal cruelty.
You can excuse racism?
That's sorry. It's a great sound.
Got the millennials in the room. But yeah, that took over for like a month, and I was so happy. It was incredible. But yeah, and it's mostly, obviously that's certain people, like, I can never tell if it's just, is it badly written romance? Is it an oversaturation of romance? Am I just aromantic, asexual, and disconnect from it entirely? It's always very weird for me personally, when it comes to like identifying, like, why am I not on board with this? And, but it is, I do like seeing the roles flipped, because it seems like, obviously I did read your book. Totally, I'm not lying about this. Not like I came in the mail yesterday. But it's it is very nice and refreshing to see the gender roles flipped from morally gray man and relatively fine, morally fine woman, and flip them a little bit. Although it seems like he has some family issues in your book.
He definitely has family issues, but I think what was really fun about their dynamic is that even though he has a lot of power, he's like very naive in his role. And I think the thing with like a lot of like morally gray men versus like not morally gray women in a lot of books is that the woman is like very naive and like doesn't know a lot about the world. Obviously not a rule. I've just like noticed that that's a trend.
Or there's the I can fix him attitude.
Right. And I think
no, girl, he doesn't need you, girl. He needs a therapist.
really. Can you imagine if there was therapy in fantasy books? Wouldn't that be amazing?
Oh my god! Like honestly, that's what I want. I want to see the morally gray man pursue the woman, and she's just like, look, you're really hot, but it's not gonna work because you're an asshole, and you need to fix yourself. Here's the card for my therapist. Go check it out.
Well, and it's funny because like I love a good morally gray man. Like I think it's like a fun time. But like I also think, for me personally, I love groveling. Like if you're like begging
Kinky girl, oh my god.
No, but like if you're like begging for forgiveness, and you like make the steps for yourself to be a better person, I really do enjoy that. So like in Sing Me to Sleep, I think Saoirse is a character who I won't call her irredeemable because I definitely don't think she is. but she is someone who does a lot of things that for, I think, most people might be a bit of a deal breaker. Murdering someone's best friend might be a deal breaker for some people. Not me, but
Who was the friend? What did they do? Were they really a best?
those are the important questions. And I think that, I think it was just kind of fun to explore the idea of someone like stepping way beyond the lines, but having the capacity of self-reflection, having a relationship with someone who also has the capacity for self-reflection, I think Saoirse as a person doesn't really understand how relationships work, and part of what she is learning throughout books 1 and 2 is the concept of like unconditional love and like what it means to accept someone's flaws, but also like, okay, we are gonna work on this. Like a combination of those two things.
They're gonna want their microphones back, so I'm gonna open the floor. Any last questions that you guys have before we start the signing process portion of the book signing thing?
My father has another question.
So
Yes, Mr. Danny Burton. Gabi Burton, sorry.
So like throughout history, like part of the cry of rebellion is if your rules don't protect me or your laws don't protect me, your laws don't apply to me, right? And so like, is there some sense in which part of what drives, and I don't know this for sure, but part of what drives Saoirse is this idea that the world she lives in, like the rules outlaw her, the laws, so forth and so on. So is part of her moral greatness rejection of that structure, or no, I just impose that?
No, I mean, so it's funny because there are, I think, a few schools of thought within some of the characters, and I don't want to spoil anything, but Saoirse's school of thought definitely is, okay, so, this world isn't designed for me. That means I get to, like, make my own rules. That is for sure her school of thought. And there are characters within both books who operate under the school of thought, okay, this world clearly isn't designed for anyone except for a specific few. That means we burn it to the ground, consequences be damned, And so I think somewhere between those two extremes, there is like the way that we can actually heal. But I think it's important to acknowledge that both of those schools of thoughts come from like really real feelings and like really valid experiences.
Can't we just burn one little corner of
Just
it
a
to the
little
ground?
corner.
I don't want the whole thing, but just singe it, just a little bit.
No, they want to burn the whole thing to the ground.
Make it medium rare.
But yeah, I think that definitely her thought process is, if this doesn't work for me, then, I get to make my own rules. And I think there's like some validity in her thought process, but not necessarily in her execution. And same for the other side as well, so. No, I
Good
understood.
wordplay. Whoa, you are another. Well, thank you all for coming so much. As person whose name I forgot said, Rachel, I'm god awful with names. I'm bad at creating them, and I'm worse at remembering them. But our books are going to be at the front of the place, right by the registers. Very convenient for you. And we'll be more than happy to sign anything and everything you shove in front of us.
Thank you
for
so
coming.
much for coming.